Hello everyone, it's Elizabeth from the Smart Stitcher. In this tutorial we're going to be taking you through how to create a pattern for your long leather glove. So this is a glove that goes right up the arm. You can of course adjust it if you want a glove that comes sort of that finishes before the elbow, but again I'm sort of doing the whole arm just to show you the method I use to work that out. If you've already watched some of my videos and you have a pattern that you know works for your upper hand, and you've got a thumb template, a fourchette template, and you know where you're putting your points, then I would say have that pattern to hand, because you can use it as you get to grips with drawing out the pattern for the extended length of glove. If you are sort of new to me and you haven't seen any of my tutorials before, I will link the tutorials where you are making your thumb piece, your fourchette, so that you can watch those and sort of get those in the right position as well. But this is the tutorial that just focuses on making the pattern, and then the second tutorial will focus on the actual construction of the glove. If you've watched any of my other gloving tutorials, you'll actually find that their process is exactly the same. You've just got a longer length of glove to finish up that final seam with. Now if you've listened to a few of my videos, you know that I talk about making a mock-up to test your pattern with practically everything I do. Leather is expensive, and one of the things that was concerning me with making a much longer glove was the fit on the arm, and I didn't want to waste my leather on just kind of getting a sense of how that particular pattern would fit. So for my mock-up for this particular pattern, I used an old pillowcase, and I just focused on sort of obviously having the thumb hole, but rather than worry about the individual fingers, I just took the measurement for the width of the hand that I would be using, and then of course the length of the glove that I was going to wear, and I made this as a mock-up. Now this doesn't have any stretch and it doesn't have any properties that are similar to leather, but it did enable me to get a sense of what the upper arm might feel like. And as you can see on my mock-up here, I did actually end up taking in some of the upper arm because that was quite wide when I did the mock-up. So you know, sometimes you've just got to adapt to the materials that are available. I personally didn't want to use lots and lots of leather in just actually working the pattern out, but I did start off by using a material that is going to be fairly unforgiving, so I knew that if it was tight it would still be tight in the leather, so there were kind of some particular uses there. Now if you've looked at a lot of vintage gloves, you might have seen that they have an opening in the wrist, which can also help get the glove on and off. Now might you please excuse my French, but this particular opening is called a mousquetaire, and I'll put the spelling on the screen for you to have a look at that. And that's also another way of sort of giving you a little bit more around the sort of the base of the wrist to be able to get the glove on and off, and then you're sort of closing it with some buttons. Now on the gloves that I've got here, these edges have got almost, they're slightly bound to give them a little bit more strength, which you would want when you're pulling that glove together. Now if you put this glove next to mine, obviously you can see that perhaps the hand that was designed to go in this is much finer than mine, and perhaps just a sort of an interesting observation on history and perhaps who this glove might have been worn by. Now in glove making we usually draw round and make the pattern for the larger hand, and to do that, or the easiest way I find of doing that is to sort of wrap the tape measure round, and I would say always pick a unit of measurement that you are happy breaking down into smaller numbers, and we're going to measure around just the sort of the hand as it is open, but the tape measure isn't sort of constricting my blood flow, it's just resting around the hand, and I can see there, and I might just move my tape measure a little bit up and down just to sort of take several measurements, and I'm looking for the widest measurement there. So I can see that that is 21.1 centimeters for my right hand open, and I'm going to do the same to the left. So my right hand is 21.1 centimeters open, and then if I do that again and repeat for the closed hand. Now I find it quite useful to sort of wrap the tape measure around and then almost sort of have it coming back under my hand again. Now what I'm looking to do is to find the widest part of my hand, and that's going to then become the second measurement for the closed fist. So I can see there that we're actually looking about 21.1 centimetres. Not quite 22.2, so no, 21.1. 22.1, sorry. Let's make that right. And then for my left hand, I'm going to repeat this again, just wrapping the tape measure around. You can work on it, whichever unit of measurement you feel comfortable with. I wouldn't recommend jumping between the two unless you're really confident in doing that. So I can see now I've got the tape measure around my hand, and I can see almost that my left hand is just, it's almost sort of 21 and a bit rather than 21.1. So I'm just going to go for 21 there, and then to close it I'll just expand that out again, and I want to sort of move the tape measure around so I get the sort of the widest bits of the hand, and I can see already that this one is a little bit smaller. So I'm going to be working with my right hand. That's looking like it's 21.85. So open, close. So I know that the pattern I'm going to be creating my glove for is for my right hand, and that is the larger one. You can of course make a pattern for both hands if you wish, absolutely fine, but where I've got my measurements are quite close, I can comfortably know that if I make for the larger hand it will fit, and then I can just adjust it if I need to for my left hand. So the first thing we're going to do is to create a paper template and create our pattern using our arm as a bit of a guide. Now if you've watched any of my other gloving tutorials, you'll know that I do like to start with my vertical line going down the page, and we're going to start with that. I'm going to get my index finger lined up with that, but my arm I'm going to try and keep as parallel as I can to that line. So I've just drawn my vertical line. It's about 6 inches from the edge of the paper, could be slightly less, but it's sort of fairly central, and it just gives me a bit of room either side to create my pattern. Now this is where it might be helpful to have somebody else or an extra pair of hands around to help you to get everything drawn on. So I want to put my index finger so that my index finger is parallel to my line, and as far as possible I want my arm, or my sort of forearm, however far I'm going, to be as flat against the table as I can get it. Now it's not going to be against the line because of the shape of your arm, but you want your forearm to be roughly parallel. Though I'm doing quite a long glove, so when I draw on I'm going to be starting with my pencil vertical, and I'm going to be coming around the shape of my hand. So if you're going to plan to wear your glove over a jumper or something like that, then you want to make sure that you are wearing that at the time. I'm just using my sort of regular arm in a t-shirt, and I'm allowing my pencil to go right down in between my fingers. It doesn't matter if my little finger's slightly spaced out, because we're actually going to be doing something else with that in a moment. So just keep the pencil vertical. It can be very, very tempting to go angle in just to sort of get underneath. Don't do that. Keep it nice and straight. Before we remove our hand, I'm just going to mark on some things where the wrist bone is, where the top of the thumb is, and where my elbow, and I'm sort of going up to the midpoint on my bicep. So I'm just going to pop that on there. So when we're creating our patterns, we've got one piece of leather which is our trank, and that is going to be fitting around the hand. Now in order to get it around the hand, we have to then sort of start adding some allowances so that the leather itself will fold around the hand to sort of encompass that sort of glove shape. And when we add those allowances, we have to do so evenly so that the hand looks balanced. You don't want to kind of add it to the middle 2 fingers, because that's going to make those look super large compared to the rest of the hand. And equally, you don't just want to add extra to the index and the 5th fingers, because that again distorts the proportions. So we have to kind of create our pattern so that it looks balanced, and it also kind of reflects the shape of the hand that you're working with. So the next thing we need to do is to start to take some measurements down. Now, one of the things we can do with a ruler is just measure across the base of each finger. So I can then sort of do that, and I can make a note of the measurements on my sheet. So I can see that that's probably looking about 2.7. So I'm just going from the base of the finger to where it meets the webbing, and I'm going to do the same for the other fingers as well. Don't worry that that little one's out to the side, that's not going to be much of an issue for us. We are going to have to add on a little bit to get around the allowances. So we're going to measure across the base of each of the fingers and just note those measurements on our sheets. The next measurement I'm going to take is just across the widest part of the flat hand. Now I think I've kind of come out to about here, and I'm just going to make sure that my ruler's on 0, and I can see that I am almost there. So just take your time just to get the measurements, but I'm looking at somewhere in the region of 8.6 centimeters for that one. The next measurement we're going to take is just around our first knuckles, and I would also do the same for the thumb if you're sort of constructing the thumb template, and just use that tutorial to help you build the thumb. So again, we're going to just wrap the tape measure around. The first knuckle is the larger knuckle, and we know that we want our glove to slide on. So for each of them, I'm just going to wrap it round. I'm not pulling it ridiculously tight, it's sitting comfortably around the finger, and I can see that that one is 6.9 centimeters. So I'm just going to add those measurements now to my sheet for each of those 4 knuckles. Now the next set of measurements I'm going to take is for my wrist, for along the midsection of my forearm, for my elbow, and also for where I want the glove to come up to my bicep. So I'm going to just show you that last one there, so to my bicep. Now I'm on a sheet of A2 paper. I might sort of just add a little bit more on, because if you're going to your bicep, you do have to sort of factor in that when you bend your elbow, the glove will sort of just come down the forearm a little bit. So you may wish to add on a few centimeters at this end if you are wanting the glove sort of in the mid bicep kind of region. So I'm just going to do exactly the same as I've done before, and I'm going to be wrapping my tape measure around. I'm going around my wrist bone this time, just to kind of get a sense, and again I'm making sure that I can actually read the tape measure, but I've just wrapped it around my wrist, and again it's sitting comfortably, it's not being pulled tight. And I can see that I'm in the region of about 18.3 there. So again, I'll be noting these measurements down on my sheet. Now, because our wrist and our elbow bend, we'll actually be taking a couple of measurements. So one with a tape measure flat, a bit like we did when we were measuring our open and closed fist, and then a second measurement with the wrist bent, just to get a sense of any kind of difference that we might need to sort of factor in. So actually there's not a massive difference for me. My bent wrist is about 18.6, so I'm just going to note those on my sheet and work my way along and just bend and flex for each of them, just to give me a rough idea about any kind of key differences. So I'll repeat the same on my forearm, repeat the same on the elbow. So once we've done our measurements down our arm, the next thing we need to do is to start working out the placement of the fingers. Now I always tend to start by working out the allowance that goes around the index finger, and we're going to need to add on a little bit more in order to then balance out our fingers and make sure that we've got a glove that's going to go around the whole hand without anything busting out of the side or anything like that. Now you can sort of measure and do it by measurement, by sort of looking at your finger and sort of measuring that. I find it quite useful to look at the measurement for the circumference of the first knuckle and do a little bit of maths kind of around that. So the circumference is 6.9 centimeters, and I know that my flat measurement across, I have actually double checked this because I was slightly wrong earlier, it's actually 2.4 and not 2.7 when I've measured it correctly. So if I look at that and say, okay, well that measurement just across that part of my hand is 2.4. If I add that to the underside of 2.4, that's going to give me 4.8. Now if I subtract 4.8 from 6.9, I am left with 2.1 centimeters. Now, in terms of how much depth I could add, I've got to sort of be quite careful, because I've got to remember that I'm going to have a fourchette on the inside of the finger, as well as the sort of the extra depth that we're adding here. So if I sort of then look at that and say, okay, overall I've got 2.1 centimeters to add to this finger, I'm going to divide that by 2, because in glove making we have a kind of where we're sort of preparing the pattern for half of the sort of hand. By doing that, when we open it out, and we find that we've actually worked out our measurements that's going to cover across the whole hand. So as I look at mine, I can see that yes, 6.9 minus 4.8 gives me 2.1. If I divide that by 2 to sort of work out how much I need to put onto sort of each finger, I know that that's 1.05 centimeters. So if I then divide that by 2 again, because of the sort of the mirroring that we'll be doing, that gives me 0.525. So I could round that up to 0.6, I could keep it at 0.5. I'll probably go with rounding it up, because I know that my fingers are quite deep. So I'm then going to draw a line that's 0.6 centimeters away from that very first line that I've drawn, and that's going to be the new line for my index finger. So this is where something like a quilter's grid can come in very handy, because you've already got lots of lines that can help you then sort of just keep an eye on how far you are away from your edge and give you a nice straight line first time. So we've added that extra line on now, so my pattern has already got that first bit of depth, and if we were to look at it in terms of how it looks on a pattern, we've added in the, be like having a line drawn here, and we've now just sort of added in that finger depth, and we've started to sort of work our way across our hand. The next line I'm going to draw is going to be another vertical line, and that's going to run through the base of my index finger where it meets my middle finger. So I'm just going to draw that straight through there, because we've already adjusted that finger. We're now going to have a look at the remaining fingers. Now, to work out how much I need to add onto my little finger, I'm just going to sort of get that ready at the moment, and I can apply the same method as I did for my index finger, even though I'm not drawing it on just yet. So if I look at the circumference of my knuckle, I know that that's 5.7 centimeters, and my measurement across the flat base is 2.2. So 2.2 plus 2.2 is 4.4. Subtract that from 5.7, that gives me 1.3 centimeters. Now again, if I divide that by 2, then I'm looking to add on at least 0.65, possibly 0.7. Because I know my finger isn't as wide as my index finger, I'm actually not going to round that one up. I'm just going to stick at 0.6. So I'll be adding 0.6 onto 2.2, which will give me 2.8 centimeters when we come to measure out our widths in a moment. Now all that remains is to work out for our middle and our fourth fingers. Now, looking at my measurements, I think I must have had a moment of madness. I've adjusted this a little bit so that it looks a little bit more in balance with the rest of the hand. So I've taken this from 2 up to 2.2 centimeters, just because it then sits a little bit better with the dimensions of my hand. So using that same method, I've then worked out where my fingers will be moving over to. So the next one I'm going to draw in is measuring in the width for my middle finger, and that is now 2.9 centimeters. So I'll be measuring 2.9 centimeters from this line, making my mark, and then drawing another vertical line. And then when I'm drawing in the next finger, it'll be measuring 2.8 from that new line, and then continuing that pattern right the way until I've got down to the end of the fifth finger. Once I've drawn all my vertical lines in, I'm then going to come back up to the top, and I'm just marking in the tops of the fingers. Now these will have shuffled over a little bit, so I'm just making sure that the top of the right finger is in its new column, and then I'm going to measure up just a 0.1 centimeter beyond the end of that, because the palm side is extended so that enables the glove to come up and around the fingers. So I'm not going to draw in that particular top, but by making the mark it'll help me when I come over to do the tracing once we've finished constructing our pattern piece. So I've marked the centres, I've actually drawn them in on both points. So I've marked a centimetre above and I've marked the centre of that line. I've also marked the centre of the finger because it can help to actually have your centre points of your fingers in, particularly when you come to draw in the fingers as well. So I've drawn my vertical lines right the way down the rest of the pattern because that's going to help me work out the allowance that I need to add on at my elbow and also the allowance further down that I need to add on for my biceps. So I'm going to start with the elbow first. Now, because I'm making a mock-up, I want to be able to to make sure that I can get it on and off, and I'm adding a couple of centimetres of ease to help with that. So how that's going to work is the measurement around my closed elbow, where the elbow bent, was 31.5 centimetres. So I've added 2 centimetres to that. And I've then had a look at working out the rest of the pattern. Now I know that the distance across here now is 11.6 centimetres. So I'm sort of going to be doing a little bit of math. So I know that if I double 11.6 I get 23.2. So I'm going to subtract 23.2 from 33.5 and that then gives me a amount of 10.3 centimetres. Now because I'm drawing out half the pattern, I divide that by 2 and I get 5.15. So I'm then going to be adding, and you can just about see where I've made my pencil mark here. I know that when I'm drafting my glove pattern I need to come through this line here. Now I've applied exactly the same technique to the bicep, and the closed bicep was 33.4 centimetres, so I've added that 2 centimetres on, and that gives me 35.4 closed centimetres. So I'm talking about the circumference here. So if I then sort of look at that in terms of how much I'm adding on, I've got 35.4 minus 23.2, which is the measurement we know across, and that gives me 12.2 centimetres. I divide that by 2 and that then gives me 6.1 centimetres. So I know at this end I'm adding 6.1 centimetres on here in order to, by the time I sort of then finish my glove, I need to come out here. Now, if you're making a mock-up, then you are going to be sort of perhaps able to sort of test whether this measurement is accurate enough for you. I found when I did mine that I actually ended up taking in that sort of upper section on the glove. So it's always a good idea to make a mock-up, even if it is in the fabric, because you want to be able to, you can take it off but you can't add it on. So you know, we're sort of working with that kind of principle. So as I look at my pattern, I know that my glove is coming out here. This is where my 5th finger is going to be. I've turned the pattern on its side for the moment, and I know further up here I've got my 2 marks where I know that they have to sort of come out in order for me to get to my forearm. So what I'm going to do is use the sort of the shape of my arm, particularly down at the forearm, to taper the sort of the side of the glove that I'm now making into a much better line than I've just drawn into my hand. So I know that I'm going to need to sort of just follow that shape down. The forearm there has got quite a nice shape to it, but then I'm going to want to sort of almost curve it out up to the elbow again, and this is going to vary as well on the shape of the arm that you're dealing with. I know that I struggle to get my sort of the very upper arm down flat, so I've got to just make sure that when I am sort of drawing out my pattern piece that it's balanced, and in order to get a nice curve I might find that I'm just going a little bit over there, and then I'm going to be sort of just gently tapering that in so that I'm not looking to extend the taper beyond that sort of widest part of the hand, but I might sort of find that I'm bringing it in and nice and carefully there. So that's the sort of the first part of our glove drawn out. And again, once you've made a mock-up, you might review that and then make the changes. The next thing to do is to actually start to using the shape of the fingers. We want to draw the fingers into position, so we've got a sort of a sense of how they're going to look. So we're almost there with the shape of our glove. I've sketched out the shape of the fingers, and I'll probably tinker with those a little bit more. I generally do. You want to follow the shape of the finger, but you also want to add a little bit of a taper, because our fingers don't just sort of go straight down at exactly the same measurement and stop. So you want to kind of add a little taper to give a little bit more of a nicer shape there. So the next thing we're going to do is to add our thumb hole, and this is where the marks that we made, where the sort of the top of the thumb webbing and the base of the thumb are going to come in handy and help us. I'm not going to draw points on this one, but I do have a video on that, so if you want to draw points on your pattern, then by all means I shall link that video as well in the description to help you do that. Now, first thing that we need to do is to just mark on our index finger line where the joint is at sort of the base of our knuckle. Now if you measure that, I know mine is about 2.5 centimeters, slightly over, but yeah, so the base of that joint, I've done quite a large black dot which doesn't help, but 2.5 centimeters down. And what I'll do on here, I will mark that. So I will measure down from the end of my, where the sort of the base of my finger between the index and middle finger is, I shall mark 2.5 centimeters down, and that is going to be the top of my thumb, and I know that the bottom of my thumb finishes where I made that mark. Now when it comes to drafting the actual sort of shape of the hole, you want to sort of almost have a look at the width of your thumb. Now I know that mine is quite fleshy, and actually slightly more generously proportioned thumbs sort of tend to sit better, I find. So I'm going to sort of allow quite a sort of a big sort of teardrop shape for that, and we're looking at somewhere in the region of about probably 4 centimeters or so for my thumb. But again, I can sort of refine that shape after that as well. So what that means in terms of my line is that my thumb will sit 2 centimeters to the left of that line and then 2 centimeters to the right. So I know that as I start to construct my teardrop shape, I'm coming out to hit these particular points. Now it's sort of pointed teardrop at the top, and then you just want to balance the curves out as you come down and around, so that will sit in there, something like that. Now in terms of constructing the rest of the thumb hole, I have already got a tutorial on that, so I will link to that, and that will just give you the rest of those particular points there. But this is where the measurement that we took across your thumb will be quite useful. So I know if I look at this, we're looking at 2.2. So if and this is where using an upright tape measure can help, because it follows the curve a little bit easier. So I'm looking at creating a mark that's about 2.2 centimeters from the top. So I'm just going to follow the curve round and then sort of make a mark, and then extend for sort of 2.2 centimeters down on that line, and then basically this final point is going to be level with our first mark to complete that sort of little section. That's where I've got another quilter's grid that's handy, so I can just make sure that my points are level with each other, and then we'll just join them up. And I might find that I'm just sort of making that a little bit smoother and just refining that curve. You have to sort of reach a point with curves where you know that you're happy, because you can spend ages on them. So if you find you get one side really good, you got your eye in, then just trace that over and just swap that onto the other side. So we've got the shape of our fingers, we know where our thumb placement is going to be, we've drawn out, sort of following the shape of our arm sympathetically, we've drawn out the body of the glove. I have added an additional 5 centimeters onto the base, because I found that although when I did my mock-up I wanted it to stop mid-bicep, in fact when I bent my arm it did sort of come down a little bit, and I wanted to just see if I could get it to stay up a little bit easier. So I've just extended my page and I've sort of just refined the lines a little bit more so that I'm happy with the overall shape. The next thing to do once we've got this is we're going to just mark on the base of the fingers. So make sure that you know exactly where the base of your fingers are, because that's going to be quite important at the sort of the next stage, because one of the sort of final things we want to do before we draw onto our tracing paper is just to move the points on the back of the hand down by 1 centimeter, and this sort of matches everything up when we come to draw our pattern in a moment. So we're moving them down so that when we trace on the back of the hand, if you look at the anatomy of your hand, you'll almost notice that the back of the hand is slightly lower than the front. So we're just reflecting that now in our design. So when we trace on the back of the hand, we'll do the lower points. When we trace on the palm view, we do the higher, the original point, and the additional centimetre at the tip there, and that just helps when we get the glove coming around the pad of the finger. The point at which we're starting to trace on is another point where if you happen to have a glove pattern that you know works and you've already drawn your points on, or you've already got your thumb position, you might choose to sort of, when we come to trace the relevant part, just sort of trace those off instead if it makes it easier for you. I mentioned that earlier. So I find at this point to have the tracing paper weighted down, particularly if it's quite springy and it wants to coil on itself. I've added a crease, so I've creased the tracing paper and I have lined that crease up with the new line that we drew for the index finger. So that's sat on that line. I'm now going to draw in the outline of my glove. I'll use a ruler where I can. I'll also we're starting with the back of the hand, so I'm going to be doing the lower points that we drew in as well. So we just finished drawing out the back of the hand, and I've just lifted it off the pattern just to show you what that looks like. So we've got the outline of half of our glove. We're then going to turn the tracing paper over and get it lined up again against our pattern piece. So I've now turned everything over and I've got just using a few weights to stop everything from moving, and I'm going to repeat the process of drawing the outline again. This time when I get to the fingers, I'm going to mark just the centres. In fact, I just need to mark the upper one, I don't really need to mark the lower one. So I've drawn in the overall outline, and if there's anywhere, sometimes you find that you're better at drawing curves on the left or the right, then we can always fold the tracing paper in half before we cut anything out and just refine the curves that way to make sure everything's symmetrical. Because we're doing the front of the hand, we're marking in the original base of the fingers, and I've also marked in my sort of halfway points up above. And what we're going to do now is, I'm not going to guess and try and draw the fingers in. I'm going to just slide the tracing paper down so that the centre marks match up and the parallel lines of course are also matching. I'm then going to just add a couple of weights, and then I can trace in the fingertips. And again, it's worth just taking your time to make sure that you're happy with the shape that you've got, because now is the time to sort of really refine it, because once we've glued it onto card we're going to start cutting things out. So you want to make sure that you are completely happy with your shape. Because we've folded the paper, it can be quite useful as well just to fold it in half, just to check how everything else kind of is coming together. I can see that I've got a few spots here just on my tracing where I'm going to refine it before we put it onto card. But once you've finished your refining, and you do need to sort of get to a point where you know that you've gone as far as you can, we're then going to glue it onto card. So once I have finished drawing everything on. I've glued it onto card, and then I have just cut everything out. Now, once you have cut everything out, and you will use an awl to poke through your holes. If you've got points on your hand, then you'll poke through the top and bottom. You'll poke through the base of the fingers on both hands. You'll cut out your thumb. As we're looking at it with the thumb here in this position, and we've got the back of the hand there, this is the right hand side. And then if we turn it over, which we will when we mark the leather, this becomes our left hand side. So it's quite useful just to write that on, because when we're drawing on the leather, we're going to want to make sure that everything is completely flat, that we've weighted it down, we've drawn around it accurately, and we've also remembered to flip our pattern to get our left and our right. Thank you for joining me on this video to construct a pattern for a long glove. In our next video, we'll be taking you through how to lay out your pattern pieces and how to sew your glove together.